monarchy, and this is the center of Ukraine. And of course, it predates the Muscovite Empire. In a way, it seems to me it's a fight for origin stories. And from the Russia's point of view, a fight to obliterate an origin story which they would rather didn't exist. Is that simplistic, or is there some truth in that impression?
Well, there is obviously this element of fight for the origin, but I do think that the question, do you hear me? The question is, what values will dominate in this land? And I think the Ukrainian part of the story, the self-story of Ukrainians, it's probably banal to say that it is a story of freedom, but I define it as a story of freedom in despite. I don't know if we can say it in English like that. For me, this is the sense of the word voля, for example, which is very important for Ukrainians, because in this region it's very difficult to have freedom protected. In Europe, in Western Europe, it's much easier. You have castles, you have lots of stones. Out of these stones, you build castles. And when you want to have freedom, because freedom was not born in the 20th century. Freedom, the idea of freedom was born very, very long time ago. You can speak about the feudal freedom of the Middle Ages, when barons and counts and the aristocracy wanted to defend their freedom, and then they were build castles, and then they were building some kind of a state, and then they were protecting the rights before the king, and then you have Magna Carta out of that, etc. In Ukraine, there was the same story in those precise years in the Middle Ages, but the problem is, due to the geography primarily, due to some other things, this space is much more fluid. It's much more open to migrations. It's much more open to the demographical changes. And therefore, it's much more difficult here to have freedom with roots. And freedom with roots, like trees with roots, like the forest of freedom. You need to protect it with institutions. The problem of this space is that institutions were always erased by one power, then another power. And what Russians were doing when they were starting to build the empire in the 15th, 16th century, they were starting by erasing the memory and erasing the institution. We rarely talk about how important for the Russian political project there is to erase this very gesture of erasing and amnesia and really saying there was nothing here. This is an empty space. So Ukrainians are trying to fight against that. Whether we will succeed or not, well, the history of the whole region and maybe of the whole planet depends on that, because it's a question whether you can assert freedom despite the whole, tradition of the whole centuries of unfreedom, and despite this imperial wish to erase it once again.
I have a quick follow-up question there, and this may be true, this may not, but someone said there was a conscious effort to destroy medieval documents that attested to this long and complex period of history. Again, talking to your idea of erasure, was this a conscious process, or something that just emerged from, say, Civil War, Revolution, Second World War, or a conscious process to erase Ukraine's medieval and post-medieval past?
Look, I might not even refer to our authors. I can refer to your authors. I can refer to the British authors. I was recently reading a book by one British author who was called, I think, Edward Clarke. And he has, it's early 19th century, and he's describing his travels to Russia. And he's describing Crimea. And it's remarkably interesting how he describes Khersones. So the Khersones is now the symbolic city for Russians, because Putin is saying, okay, we come from the Kyiv state. He doesn't call it Kyiv state, but he believes that the Prince Volodymyr, who was ruling in Kyiv, who was ruling here, is actually his predecessor. He's calling him Vladimir, he's building status in Moscow, and he thinks that the key starting point of the Russian history is when Prince Volodymyr from Kyiv, came to Khersones and was baptized into Christianity and brought Christianity to these lands. So the problem is that now, if you were in Crimea, if you were in Sevastopol, where you have these ruins of Khersones, you understand that these are ruins, that there is practically nothing there. So, and the news we are getting from this region now is that this destruction of these monuments continues. But then you go and read this travelogue in the early 19th century, and you understand that this British guy came to Crimea, and he was saying, look, there were still ruins of a quiet and a big city. There were still gates. There were still doors in the building. And then the Russian Empire was just destroying it, taking marble out of that, building some, huts instead of that. So, and then you ask a question, okay, if you consider this a symbolic place for you, then why are you destroying it? Then we have, of course, lots of our Ukrainian authors. For example, our famous poet, Taras Shevchenko, who has this very striking image of Russians coming and destroying what he was calling mohila. And what he was calling mohilas, graves, was actually these kurgans, these big places where lots of, let's say, prehistoric or pre-Christian cultures were burying their dead. We are talking about Scythians, we are talking about others. And for him, it was a very traumatic experience, as if the Russians were going and erasing these traces. So I do think that this is an important element to think about, because Europe was built upon the idea of legacy. So we built something, the Germanic tribes built something, the Celtic tribes built something, but you take the legacy from the Greek world, you take the aesthetics from the Greek world, you take the Roman law from the Roman Empire, you take the language partially from the Roman Empire. How many Latin words do you have in English, for example, right? Let's think about it. I think in the Russian conception of history is totally different through centuries. It's a rather conception that we're raising the cultures. We do not build upon them. We're raising, and we are saying we came to the empty space.
A follow-up question. Can storytelling and stories shape such legacy when there are no institutions, when there are literally no physical evidence of previous times?
Yes, I do think that stories is an important thing, because again, what do you do when you don't have you have a much lesser number of cities, for example. The city is a good proto image of institution, because it's kind of made out of stone. We have lesser number of cities in Ukraine, but we do have cities, and I think one of the identities of Ukraine is the identity of cities. You came to Lviv, and then you came to Kyiv, and I came back to Kharkiv yesterday, and you have Dnipro, and you have Odessa, and you have Kherson, and you have Kropivnitsky, and you have Vinnytsia, and you have Ivano-Frankivsk, and you have Donetsk, and you have Luhansk, and you have Simferopol, and you have... These are very, very different types of cities. So the way how people in Dnipro think, or the way how people in Kharkiv think and how they act, is very, very different from the way how people in Kyiv think and act, and Lviv, etc. And this is this richness of Ukrainian city culture, which I think comes back to medieval times, comes back to the Greek times. So the idea of polis is very, very important. But when you don't have cities, for example, in this big step that we have, the part of our history, and at the same time, right now, archaeology tells us that this very old culture that we are calling Tripilian culture was famous for producing big settlements. So we have this story of cities in Ukraine. The problem is that you don't you don't necessarily have these, traces in stone, like in Greece or Rome, etc. Then you have invent something. Then you have tell the stories, and this is a very important thing: how we are telling the stories about our past, how we're telling the stories about the time that we actually don't have much written evidence about, because it's our history as well. This archaeology of culture is very interesting.